California's landscapes are often associated with opportunity, movement, and reinvention, yet scattered across its highways, mountain towns, forests, deserts, and growing cities are stories that never reached a conclusion. A nurse leaves work and is never seen again. A teenager accepts a ride along a freeway and vanishes. Deep within remote valleys and beneath towering pines, searchers uncover fragments of evidence while the most important questions remain unanswered. Decades later, many of these disappearances still exist as unfinished investigations suspended between fact and mystery. In this investigation, you will move through crime scenes, abandoned trails, witness accounts, missing vehicles, cryptic messages, and vast wilderness regions where certainty seems to disappear as quickly as the people being sought. From the forests of Northern California to the deserts near Death Valley and the streets of Los Angeles and San Francisco, each case reveals a different path into the unknown, where evidence exists, explanations do not, and the truth remains just beyond reach, the actress who left a cryptic note. The glow of Hollywood in the late 1940s promised visibility, recognition, and opportunity. Yet it also created an environment where people could move through crowded streets and busy studios without anyone noticing where they went once the cameras stopped rolling. Beneath the bright marquees and carefully crafted public images was a city filled with aspiring actors, late-night meetings, personal secrets, and ambitions that often extended far beyond what appeared on screen. It was a place where thousands arrived hoping to be seen, making it all the more unsettling when someone seemed to disappear from view entirely. Among the many mysteries that emerged from that era, one case would endure for decades because of how little it appeared to make sense from the very beginning. By the autumn of 1949, Jean Spangler was 26 years old and attempting to build a career in Hollywood. She had appeared as a dancer and extra in several films and was known among friends and colleagues as someone determined to succeed in the entertainment industry. Like many young performers of the period, she balanced auditions and studio work with the realities of everyday life. She was also the mother of a young daughter and had recently been involved in a difficult custody dispute with her former husband. Although her acting career had not yet reached the level she hoped for, she remained active in Hollywood circles and continued pursuing opportunities whenever they appeared. Nothing about October 7, 1949 seemed destined to become part of one of California's most enduring disappearance cases. That evening, Jean left her home in Los Angeles after telling family members that she planned to meet her former husband regarding child support payments, before later attending a work-related meeting. Accounts differ slightly regarding the exact details she provided, but the general impression she left behind was that she expected to be out for several hours and would return later that night. There was no indication that she believed she was in danger, nor did she appear to be preparing for any significant departure. Hours passed without concern at first. Los Angeles was a sprawling city, and people often returned home late from social engagements, work commitments, or meetings connected to the film industry. As the night continued, however, Jean failed to return. Family members became increasingly uneasy, particularly because her disappearance seemed inconsistent with her responsibilities and routine behaviour. The concern deepened when the following day arrived with no sign of her and no communication explaining her absence. Investigators soon began reconstructing the final known movements of Jean Spangler, but establishing a reliable timeline proved surprisingly difficult. Witnesses reported seeing her on the evening she vanished, yet no single account clearly explained where she ultimately went. Like many disappearance investigations, the case quickly became a puzzle, assembled from fragmented recollections, uncertain observations, and missing pieces. Every lead seemed to reveal another question rather than an answer. Then a discovery transformed the investigation from a missing person inquiry into something far more mysterious. 2 days after Jean disappeared, her purse was found in Los Angeles near the entrance to Griffith Park. The location immediately attracted attention. Griffith Park was and remains one of the largest urban parks in the United States, containing rugged terrain, isolated roads, and large stretches of land where someone could easily move beyond public view. The purse appeared abandoned rather than accidentally lost, and its contents suggested that whoever had left it there had done so deliberately. Inside the purse was the item that would define the case for generations, a partially completed handwritten note. Addressed to someone named Kirk, the note reportedly read, Can't wait any longer. Going to see Dr. Scott. It will work best this way while Mother is away." The message ended abruptly before it could be completed. There was no signature, no explanation, and no indication of what Jean intended to discuss. The unfinished nature of the note was especially unsettling. It created the impression that she had been interrupted while writing, though investigators could never determine precisely when or under what circumstances it had been written. Almost immediately, attention focused on identifying the people mentioned in the note. Who was Kirk? Who was Dr. Scott? The answers seemed as though they should have been straightforward, yet they quickly became sources of confusion. Investigators discovered that Jean knew several individuals whose names might connect to the message. The most famous possibility emerged when reports surfaced linking the name Kirk to actor Kirk Douglas. At the time, Douglas was a rising Hollywood star who had worked on a film in which Jean appeared as an extra. The possibility generated enormous public interest. Newspapers eagerly explored the connection, and speculation spread rapidly throughout Hollywood. Yet when questioned, Douglas denied having a close relationship with Jean and stated that he had not seen her for some time before her disappearance. Investigators ultimately found no evidence connecting him to whatever happened that night. The publicity surrounding his name kept the story in headlines, but it did little to move the investigation closer to a solution. The reference to Dr. Scott proved equally elusive. Some theories suggested that the note referred to a physician. Others proposed that Scott might not have been a doctor at all, but rather someone using a nickname or title. During the late 1940s, illegal abortions were often conducted in secret due to restrictive laws, and investigators explored the possibility that Jean had intended to meet someone connected to such procedures. This theory gained traction because friends reportedly told investigators that Jean may have been pregnant. Yet no evidence conclusively established a pregnancy, and no individual identified as Dr. Scott was ever definitively linked to her disappearance. As detectives dug deeper into Jean's personal life, they uncovered a network of relationships that complicated the picture further. She was known to socialize within Hollywood circles, where actors, producers, agents, and aspiring performers frequently crossed paths. Various acquaintances were interviewed, and numerous leads emerged. Some witnesses claimed she had seemed worried about something in the days before she vanished. Others described her as optimistic and focused on her future. The differing accounts made it difficult to distinguish meaningful clues from ordinary observations coloured by hindsight. Particular attention was also directed toward Jean's former husband, given the custody dispute and reported plans to meet him on the night she disappeared. Investigators examined the possibility that domestic conflict might have played a role. However, despite scrutiny and questioning, no evidence emerged that directly connected him to her disappearance. The same pattern repeated throughout the investigation. Individuals appeared potentially significant at first, only for leads to weaken under closer examination. What made the case especially troubling was the absence of physical evidence beyond the purse and note. There was no confirmed crime scene, there were no verified signs of violence, there were no confirmed sightings that clearly established her final destination. Investigators found themselves confronting a mystery built largely from what was missing rather than what was present. Every theory relied on assumptions about events that no witness could confirm. Public fascination continued to grow as the weeks became months. Newspapers revisited the case repeatedly, often emphasizing the cryptic note and Hollywood connections. The disappearance seemed to contain all the elements of a mystery novel. A young actress, secret meetings, unexplained references, and a sudden vanishing without a trace. Yet unlike fiction, there was no final chapter waiting to reveal what happened. Each passing year only deepened the uncertainty. Numerous theories emerged over the decades. Some believed Jean had become the victim of foul play after arranging a meeting with someone she trusted. Others argued that an illegal medical procedure may have gone wrong, leading those involved to conceal what happened. Still others suggested connections to organized crime, a possibility fueled more by Hollywood's reputation and public imagination than by documented evidence. Each theory attempted to explain the same problem: how someone could disappear from one of America's largest cities while leaving behind so little evidence. The passage of time did not resolve the mystery. Investigators, journalists, researchers, and amateur sleuths continued examining the case long after the original search ended, yet the fundamental questions remained unchanged. Who was Kirk? Who was Dr. Scott? Why was the note unfinished? Was the purse deliberately placed in Griffith Park to mislead investigators, or was it genuinely connected to the location where events unfolded? The available evidence was simply too limited to provide definitive answers. More than 70 years later, Jean Spangler's disappearance remains one of California's most famous unsolved cases. The city around it has transformed dramatically since 1949. Buildings have risen and disappeared, neighborhoods have changed, and generations have come and gone. Yet the mystery endures because the central facts remain as unsettling today as they were when her family first realized she had not returned home. A young actress stepped out into the Los Angeles night, and the trail she left behind ended with a purse, a cryptic note, and a series of questions that nobody has ever been able to answer. Somewhere behind the unfinished sentence addressed to Kirk, the true story of Jean Spangler still waits to be found. The child taken in front of witnesses. Few places inspire more confidence than a busy shopping centre, filled with families going about an ordinary afternoon. Cars move through parking lots, shoppers carry bags between stores, and children weave through crowds under the assumption that dozens of nearby strangers create a kind of safety. It is an environment built around visibility, where people expect to be seen and where unusual events rarely remain unnoticed for long. Yet some of California's most disturbing mysteries began in precisely these settings. The disappearance of 9-year-old Michaela Gerecht would become one of them, not because nobody witnessed what happened, but because people did. Across the East Bay city of Hayward, November the 7th, 1988, unfolded with the kind of routine that rarely attracts attention. School had ended, businesses remained open, and families were moving through the final hours of an ordinary Monday afternoon. Nothing about the day suggested it would become permanently etched into California's history of unsolved disappearances. The streets were active, the shopping centres busy, and life continued with the predictability people often take for granted until something shatters it. Unlike the famous Hollywood mysteries that often begin with secret meetings and cryptic messages, Michaela Gerecht's story started with childhood simplicity. Michaela was a 4th grade student known for her energy and outgoing personality. Friends and family described her as confident and independent, qualities that made her comfortable navigating familiar places within her community. On that afternoon, she and a friend travelled to the Rainbow Market shopping centre in Hayward, a location they knew well. There was nothing remarkable about the trip itself. For countless children, similar errands and outings ended without incident every day. Near the entrance of the Rainbow Market shopping centre, a seemingly minor inconvenience was about to alter the course of countless lives. Michaela and her friend left their scooters near the front of a store while they went inside. When they returned, they discovered that one of the scooters had been moved. It was a small disruption, the sort of thing that might cause brief annoyance but little concern. Michaela's scooter remained where she expected it to be, but her friend's scooter had been relocated several feet away. The girls walked toward it, likely focused on nothing more than retrieving it and continuing their afternoon. Several seconds were all it took for an ordinary moment to become the centre of a criminal investigation that would last decades. As Michaela approached the scooter, a man suddenly grabbed her. Witnesses later reported seeing the struggle unfold in the parking lot. According to accounts gathered by investigators, the man pulled her toward a waiting vehicle. Michaela reportedly fought back and screamed. The attack was neither subtle nor concealed. It occurred in daylight, in an area where people were present, making the speed of the abduction all the more shocking. Before panic could fully take hold, witnesses were already trying to understand exactly what they had just seen. Some people initially struggled to process the scene before them. Human beings are accustomed to interpreting public spaces as orderly environments, and sudden acts of violence often create moments of hesitation as observers attempt to make sense of what is happening. By the time many realized that a child was being abducted, the vehicle was already leaving. The man drove away with Michaela inside, disappearing from the parking lot almost as quickly as he'd appeared. Within the first hours after Michaela vanished, the search expanded far beyond the parking lot where she was last seen. Family members, friends, volunteers, and law enforcement officers mobilized rapidly. Missing child investigations often begin with uncertainty about whether a child has wandered away, become lost, or left voluntarily. This case was different. Witnesses had observed an abduction. Investigators knew immediately that they were dealing with a serious crime, the urgency transformed the search effort from the very beginning. Unlike many disappearances that begin with uncertainty about a victim's final movements, this case offered investigators a clear starting point. Witnesses provided descriptions of the suspect and his vehicle. Composite sketches were created based on those observations. The man was generally described as white, in his 20s, with long blonde hair. The vehicle was described as an older model car, though witness recollections varied regarding specific details. While these accounts gave investigators more information than many missing person cases ever possess, they still fell short of providing a clear path toward identifying the abductor. As detectives assembled statements from witnesses, a troubling picture gradually began to emerge. The abduction appeared to have been opportunistic, yet strangely confident. The suspect had acted in broad daylight and in front of multiple people. Such behaviour suggested either extraordinary recklessness or a belief that he could complete the crime before anyone intervened. Investigators examined the possibility that Michaela had been specifically targeted, but establishing a motive proved difficult. There was no obvious connection between the victim and any known suspect. The crime seemed to exist without a clear explanation. Media coverage soon spread throughout California. Missing child cases often generate public attention, but the circumstances surrounding Michaela's disappearance gave the story particular power. Parents could easily imagine their own children standing in that parking lot. The idea that a child could be taken so quickly, despite nearby witnesses, challenged assumptions about safety in public spaces. Flyers appeared throughout the region. Television broadcasts carried her photograph. Tips began arriving from members of the public who hoped they had seen something useful. Years of investigation produced numerous leads, yet none succeeded in revealing where Michaela had been taken. Sightings were reported from various locations, as often happens in high-profile missing person cases. Some tips appeared promising at first before collapsing under scrutiny. Others led investigators in entirely different directions. Detectives followed hundreds of leads, each carrying the possibility of a breakthrough. Again and again, those possibilities dissolved into uncertainty. Complicating matters was the passage of time itself. Memories fade, witnesses move away, physical evidence deteriorates. What begins as an active investigation gradually becomes a long-term mystery. Yet Michaela's family refused to let the case disappear from public awareness. Year after year, they continued advocating for renewed attention, hoping that someone with crucial information would eventually come forward. Their persistence ensured that the case remained visible even as decades passed. Long after the initial search ended, advances in forensic technology encouraged investigators to revisit evidence that had once seemed exhausted. Many cold cases across the United States benefited from developments in DNA analysis, and Michaela's case was no exception. Investigators reviewed evidence collected years earlier, searching for opportunities that earlier generations of forensic science could not provide. The possibility that modern technology might succeed where traditional methods had failed offered a measure of hope. A significant development emerged decades after the disappearance, when investigators identified a suspect through DNA evidence. The individual, David Misch, was already serving prison sentences related to other crimes. Authorities announced that evidence connected him to Michaela's abduction, marking one of the most important developments in the history of the case. For many observers, the news appeared to represent a major breakthrough. After more than 3 decades, investigators finally had someone they believed was responsible. Even so, critical questions remained unanswered. Identifying a suspect did not automatically reveal what happened to Michaela after she was taken. Her body had never been found. The circumstances of her final hours remained unknown. While legal proceedings and investigative findings brought greater clarity to parts of the case, they did not eliminate the central mystery that had haunted her family since 1988. The absence of definitive answers continued to cast a shadow over the investigation. Standing at the heart of the case was a contradiction that made the disappearance particularly difficult to forget. Many unsolved disappearances involve isolated locations, missing timelines, or a complete lack of witnesses. Michaela Garrett's abduction involved none of those elements. People saw her moments before she vanished. Witnesses observed the suspect. Investigators knew where the crime occurred and approximately how it unfolded. Yet despite those advantages, the case resisted resolution for decades. The mystery survived not because nobody saw anything, but because what they saw was not enough. The Rainbow Market shopping centre remained an ordinary place after the disappearance. Customers continued arriving. Businesses opened and closed. Daily life resumed around the location where a child had vanished. Such places often become unsettling precisely because they appear so normal. There are no dramatic landscapes, abandoned buildings, or remote wilderness trails to explain the mystery. There is only a parking lot where families once went about their routines and where a brief sequence of events changed countless lives forever. For investigators, the case became a reminder of how quickly opportunities can disappear. For parents, it became a warning about vulnerabilities hidden within familiar environments. For the public, it became one of California's most haunting examples of a crime committed in plain sight. Decades later, people still return to the same troubling question. How could so many people witness the beginning of the event and still be unable to prevent what followed? The parking lot where Michaela Gerecht was last seen remained exactly where it had always been, while the answer to what happened there never arrived. The boy who never came home from school. Most walks home leave no record of themselves once the front door closes behind them. They're among the most ordinary journeys people make, repeated so often that the details quickly fade from memory. Streets become familiar, intersections become automatic, and distances shrink into routine. Parents expect children to arrive at roughly the same time every day, rarely considering how many assumptions are built into that expectation. The disappearance of Kevin Collins remains disturbing because it transformed one of the most predictable parts of childhood into a mystery that investigators have never been able to fully explain. Every afternoon, San Francisco's residential streets carried students back toward families waiting for them at home. In the summer of 1984, the city was a place of busy neighborhoods, steep hills, and tightly connected communities where children often walked familiar routes without attracting concern. The journey between school and home was usually measured in minutes rather than hours. For most families, the route was so routine that it seemed almost invisible. Yet some mysteries emerge not from extraordinary circumstances, but from ordinary moments that suddenly stop making sense. For 12-year-old Kevin Collins, June 10th, 1984, should have ended like any other day. Kevin was a student at St. Agnes School in San Francisco. Friends and family described him as bright, responsible, and dependable. There was nothing in his behaviour that day to suggest he planned to go anywhere unusual or that he anticipated danger. School was ending for the day, summer vacation was approaching, and there appeared to be every reason to expect that Kevin would soon return home. Only a few confirmed moments survive from the hours investigators later examined most closely. Kevin was last seen leaving St. Agnes School during the afternoon. Witnesses reported seeing him walking away from campus, beginning what should have been a relatively short trip home. The route itself was neither isolated nor particularly dangerous. It passed through a populated part of the city where people regularly moved between homes, schools, businesses, and public transportation stops. On paper, it looked like the kind of journey a child could complete without difficulty. What troubled detectives from the beginning was not the presence of conflicting evidence, but the absence of it. Missing person investigations often begin with a final sighting that leads toward a specific location, vehicle, or suspect. In Kevin's case, the trail seemed to fade almost immediately. There was no confirmed scene of an abduction, no obvious indication of violence, and no clear point where investigators could say with certainty that something had gone wrong. Instead, there was a stretch of time that appeared normal until it wasn't. As concern spread through Kevin's family, an ordinary delay quickly transformed into something far more alarming. When Kevin failed to arrive home, relatives began trying to determine where he might be. Initial explanations were simple and reasonable. Perhaps he'd stopped to visit a friend. Perhaps he'd become distracted on the way home. Yet as the hours passed without contact, those possibilities became increasingly difficult to accept. The realization that something unusual had happened arrived gradually and then all at once. Across the city, search efforts expanded with remarkable speed once it became clear that Kevin was missing. Family members, friends, police officers, and volunteers began looking for signs that might explain his disappearance. Streets were searched, neighbors were questioned. Investigators worked to reconstruct his expected route and identify anyone who might have encountered him. The search reflected a growing awareness that every passing hour reduced the chances of finding straightforward answers. Numerous tips arrived during the first stages of the investigation, each carrying the possibility of a breakthrough. Reports from members of the public suggested various sightings and encounters. Some appeared credible at first glance, while others quickly collapsed under scrutiny. Such tips are common in high-profile missing person cases. People recall details they had not considered important at the time, and communities become intensely focused on identifying anything that might help. Yet the sheer volume of information often creates new challenges. Investigators must separate meaningful evidence from misunderstandings, rumours, and mistaken recollections. Among the many leads examined by investigators, one account would attract particular attention. Witnesses reported seeing Kevin in the company of an unidentified man shortly before his disappearance. According to descriptions gathered during the investigation, the man appeared older and was observed speaking with Kevin. Detectives devoted significant effort to identifying and locating him. Composite sketches were developed and released to the public. The possibility that this individual represented the key to understanding Kevin's disappearance generated considerable interest. At first, the lead appeared promising because it offered something the investigation desperately needed: a person. Until then, much of the case had revolved around an absence of information. The unidentified man provided a tangible direction for investigators to pursue. Public appeals encouraged anyone who recognized the individual to come forward. Yet despite widespread attention, no conclusive identification emerged. The figure remained a shadow within the investigation, significant enough to attract scrutiny but never clearly connected to what happened. Weeks turned into months without producing the answer that searchers believed must exist somewhere. The case increasingly challenged assumptions about how disappearances are supposed to unfold. A child had left school in a major American city and failed to arrive home. Yet despite substantial media coverage, extensive searches and numerous investigative efforts, the mystery remained intact. Every avenue seemed to end with the same frustrating reality. There was still no clear understanding of where Kevin had gone. Media attention played a major role in keeping the case in public view. Photographs of Kevin circulated throughout California. News reports revisited the story repeatedly, updating audiences on new leads and investigative developments. Missing child cases possess a unique emotional impact because they confront people with the vulnerability of ordinary routines. The image of a child simply walking home resonated deeply with parents who saw reflections of their own families in the case. Far beyond the immediate investigation, the disappearance left a lasting impression on parents throughout the region. The 1980s witnessed growing public concern about child safety, and Kevin's case became one of the events that intensified those fears. Families who had once viewed short walks through familiar neighborhoods as harmless began reconsidering assumptions they had rarely questioned. Schools, community groups, and law enforcement agencies increasingly emphasized safety awareness. Although Kevin's disappearance did not single-handedly create these changes, it became part of a broader cultural shift. As years passed, investigators continued revisiting the case. Cold case reviews examined evidence collected during the original investigation and explored whether new technologies or fresh perspectives might reveal overlooked clues. Missing person investigations often experience cycles of renewed attention, particularly when advances in forensic science create opportunities unavailable to earlier investigators. Each review carried the possibility that a forgotten detail might finally illuminate the missing portion of the story. The challenge, however, remained fundamentally the same. Unlike cases involving discovered crime scenes or recovered physical evidence, Kevin's disappearance offered remarkably little to work with. Detectives could analyze witness statements, re-examine timelines, and revisit leads, but they could not return to a clearly defined location where the mystery began. The uncertainty surrounding his final movements remained the central obstacle. Investigators knew where Kevin started his journey. They never discovered where it truly ended. Public fascination with the case endured because of this uncertainty. Human beings naturally seek explanations, particularly when confronted with events that seem to violate ordinary expectations. Kevin Collins did not vanish during an expedition into remote wilderness. He did not disappear while traveling through an unfamiliar city. He was walking home through his own neighborhood. The simplicity of that fact makes the mystery more unsettling rather than less. It removes many of the explanations people instinctively reach for when considering disappearances. Decades of inquiry have revealed fragments of Kevin Collins' story, but never its conclusion. Investigators know who he was. They know where he attended school. They know roughly when he began walking home. They know the route he likely intended to follow. Yet between those established facts lies a gap that has resisted every effort to close it. The mystery survives not because there are too many possibilities, but because there are too few certainties. Many unsolved disappearances leave behind physical clues that encourage endless speculation. Others generate dramatic theories involving suspects, confessions, or discoveries made years later. Kevin Collins's case remains different. Its power comes from its simplicity. A boy left school, he started home. Somewhere between those 2 points, the story disappeared from view. Everything investigators have done since then has been an attempt to recover the missing pages. Between the school he left behind and the home he never reached, Kevin Collins disappeared into a stretch of time that remains unexplained. The college student who disappeared in San Francisco. Cities possess a remarkable ability to absorb people into their rhythm without leaving much trace of where they go next. Every day, strangers arrive, pursue opportunities, change plans, meet new people, and disappear back into the flow of urban life. Most of these movements are ordinary and unremarkable. Yet the same qualities that make a city feel alive can also make it difficult to follow a single person's path once it begins to diverge from expectation. Few places illustrate that reality more clearly than San Francisco, where one young woman's promising summer gradually transformed into a mystery that investigators have never been able to resolve. During the summer of 1997, San Francisco offered the kind of freedom that attracted young people from across the country. The city was known for its universities, cultural diversity, an endless stream of visitors. Students arrived seeking experience, independence, and adventure. Neighborhoods shifted dramatically from one block to the next, creating an environment where someone could spend an entire day exploring unfamiliar places without ever leaving the city. For many young adults, it represented possibility. For investigators examining the disappearance of Kristen Modafferi, those same possibilities would eventually become part of the problem. Among the thousands arriving with plans for the future was 18-year-old Kristen Modafferi. Originally from North Carolina, she had recently completed her first year at college and traveled to California for the summer. Friends and family described her as intelligent, energetic, and eager to embrace new experiences. She was independent enough to travel across the country but remained close to her family, maintaining regular contact and sharing details about her life. Nothing about her behavior suggested someone preparing to vanish voluntarily or abandon the future she had been building. Far from her home in North Carolina, Kristen appeared to be building exactly the kind of experience she'd hoped for. She secured employment at Spinelli Coffee Company, a cafe located in San Francisco. The job provided income and an opportunity to immerse herself in city life. She also shared housing with roommates and explored the city during her free time. By all available accounts, she was adapting well to her new surroundings. Her summer seemed defined by the ordinary challenges and opportunities faced by countless students spending time away from home. Nothing in the known events of June 23rd suggested that investigators would later scrutinize the day in extraordinary detail. Kristen worked her shift at Spinelli Coffee Company as expected. Co-workers interacted with her normally, and there were no reports of unusual behavior or indications that she felt threatened. When people later reconstructed the final confirmed day of her known movements, they found little that immediately stood out. Like many disappearance cases, the significance of seemingly ordinary details only emerged after she failed to return. One possibility emerged from information indicating that Kristen may have intended to travel toward Ocean Beach. During the investigation, reports surfaced, suggesting she planned to participate in a volunteer program connected to environmental cleanup efforts. The information appeared promising because it provided a possible destination after work. If investigators could verify where she intended to go, they might narrow the area where her trail ended. Yet the lead quickly became complicated. While there were indications that Kristen expressed interest in such activities, confirming her exact plans proved difficult. Investigators explored the volunteer angle extensively. Ocean Beach stretches along the western edge of San Francisco and presents a dramatically different atmosphere from the city's busy commercial districts. The beach is expansive, often windy, and bordered by the Pacific Ocean. On one hand, it seemed plausible that Kristen would be attracted to a volunteer project in such a location. On the other hand, investigators could not conclusively establish that she actually participated in any organized event there that day. The possibility remained compelling, but uncertain. Separate accounts introduced another element that detectives could never fully resolve. Witnesses reported interactions involving Kristen and an unidentified man. According to some accounts gathered during the investigation, she had been seen speaking with a man shortly before her disappearance. The reported encounters attracted significant attention because they offered a potential explanation for where her movements diverged from expectation. Yet, as with many aspects of the case, the available information lacked the clarity necessary to transform suspicion into certainty. The unidentified man became an important focus because he represented something investigators desperately needed: a tangible lead. Missing person investigations often progress by identifying the last person known to have interacted with the victim. If detectives could determine who this individual was and verify the nature of his relationship with Kristen, they might finally establish what happened after she left work. Despite considerable effort, however, investigators never succeeded in fully resolving the questions surrounding these reported encounters. Rather than narrowing toward a single explanation, the investigation gradually produced several competing versions of what might have happened. Some theories suggested that Kristen accepted a ride from someone she believed she could trust. Others proposed that she encountered danger while traveling to a destination she had not shared with friends or family. Still, others focused on the possibility of an accidental death that somehow escaped detection. Each theory drew support from particular pieces of information, yet none explained every aspect of the case. One of the most frustrating features of the investigation was the absence of evidence strong enough to eliminate alternative possibilities. In some missing person cases, physical evidence eventually points investigators toward a specific conclusion. Kristen's disappearance resisted that process. Every proposed explanation left important questions unanswered. Detectives repeatedly found themselves confronting a collection of possibilities rather than a coherent narrative. Tips arrived from distant locations as awareness of the case spread beyond California. Reports suggested that Kristen had been seen in various cities and states. Family members and investigators examined these leads carefully, hoping that one might finally reveal where she had gone. Such reports are common in high-profile disappearances. Members of the public often believe they have encountered the missing individual, particularly when photographs receive widespread circulation. While some sightings appeared promising at first, none could be conclusively verified. Repeated efforts to verify those leads often ended where the investigation had begun. Detectives travelled, interviewed witnesses, and examined evidence connected to reported sightings. Again and again, the trail dissolved. The pattern became painfully familiar. A new lead would generate hope, attract attention, and appear capable of producing answers. Then, after careful examination, it would fail to withstand scrutiny. The investigation would return to uncertainty. For Kristen's family, the disappearance created a unique form of anguish. Cases involving confirmed deaths eventually provide some measure of certainty, however painful. Cases involving unresolved disappearances deny even that. Family members are left confronting multiple possibilities simultaneously. Hope and fear coexist because neither can be completely dismissed. The absence of definitive information becomes its own burden, renewed every time another lead collapses. Decades of analysis have done little to eliminate the uncertainty surrounding Kristen's final known day. Law enforcement agencies have continued reviewing the case, and investigators have revisited evidence numerous times. Advances in technology have encouraged renewed examinations of older disappearances throughout the country. Yet despite these efforts, the central mystery remains remarkably resistant to resolution. The same fundamental questions persist because the evidence has never pointed decisively in one direction. What distinguishes Kristen Modafferi's disappearance from many others is the number of plausible explanations that remain available. Some mysteries eventually settle around a dominant theory, even if definitive proof never emerges. In Kristen's case, investigators have never reached that point. Several scenarios remain possible, each supported by fragments of information. The result is a case that feels suspended between multiple realities, none of which can be confirmed. Standing between the available evidence and the truth was a collection of unanswered questions that never aligned into a complete picture. Did Kristen reach the destination she may have intended to visit? Was the unidentified man significant or merely an incidental figure? Did something unexpected occur during a journey that should have been routine? Each question appears simple in isolation. Together, they form a barrier that investigators have been unable to cross. The city where Kristen disappeared has changed considerably since 1997. Businesses have closed and reopened. Neighbourhoods have evolved. Millions of people have moved through the same street she once walked. Yet the mystery remains frozen in time, anchored to a summer afternoon that refuses to yield its secrets. Investigators know who Kristen was, where she worked, and many of the choices she considered during her final known day. What they do not know is which choice ultimately mattered. Somewhere beyond the last confirmed sighting of Kristen Modafferi, the facts give way to possibilities, and that is where the mystery still remains, the family that vanished into Death Valley. Across the floor of Death Valley, vast distances can appear deceptively small beneath an open sky. Mountains that seem only a short drive away may require hours to reach, while dry valleys stretch far beyond what the eye initially perceives. Roads thread through the landscape like thin lines across an enormous canvas, creating an illusion of accessibility that has misled travellers for generations. The environment is often described as beautiful, but beauty is only part of the story. Death Valley is also one of the harshest places in North America, where heat, isolation, and geography combine to punish mistakes with extraordinary efficiency. From the perspective of a road map, the region often seems far more navigable than it truly is. Roads intersect, routes branch into old mining areas, and dirt tracks disappear into remote sections of desert terrain. A traveller examining a map may see what appears to be a straightforward path from one destination to another. The landscape itself tells a different story. Distances are greater than they seem, conditions change rapidly, and roads that appear usable on paper may become difficult or impossible to traverse. Understanding this disconnect would eventually become central to one of California's most puzzling disappearance cases. Among the many tourists travelling through the American West during the summer of 1996 was a family from Germany. The group consisted of Cornelia Meyer, her son Max Decklin, and Cornelia's partner Egbert Rimkus, along with Rimkus's son Georg Weber. They were exploring the United States during a vacation that included visits to several well-known destinations. Like countless international travellers before them, they were drawn by the vast landscapes of the American West and the opportunity to experience places very different from those they knew at home. For several days, their vacation unfolded in a manner that appeared entirely ordinary. The family travelled through California and Nevada, moving between destinations and taking photographs along the way. Records of their trip suggest no indication that they were experiencing unusual difficulties. They rented a green Plymouth Voyager minivan and continued through the region much like other tourists exploring national parks and scenic routes. Nothing about their plans suggested that they would soon become the subject of a mystery that would endure for years. Everything investigators thought they understood began to change after a rented minivan was discovered in an unexpected location. The vehicle was found abandoned in a remote area known as Anvil Canyon, west of Death Valley National Park. The location immediately raised questions because it was far from the routes most visitors would normally take. Even more puzzling, the minivan did not appear to be hidden. It sat in the desert as if its occupants had simply stepped away. Yet there was no sign of the family. Inside the vehicle, investigators found clues that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Personal belongings remained in the minivan, including some possessions that travellers would not normally abandon voluntarily. The vehicle itself appeared to have become stuck while attempting to travel through rough terrain. Tyre damage and mechanical difficulties suggested that continuing by vehicle had become impossible. What investigators could not determine was why the family had travelled into such a remote area in the first place. No obvious explanation seemed capable of accounting for how the vehicle had reached that particular place. Death Valley contains numerous paved roads used by tourists, yet the family had somehow ended up far from those routes. Investigators began examining maps, guidebooks, and possible travel plans in an effort to reconstruct their movements. The further they looked, the more confusing the situation became. The location of the minivan did not fit comfortably with any straightforward explanation of where the family had intended to go. One theory suggested that the travellers may have been attempting to reach a nearby road after becoming lost. Another possibility involved navigational errors caused by outdated maps or misunderstandings about the condition of certain routes. Yet even these explanations left important questions unanswered. Why had they chosen the route they followed? What information guided their decisions? And perhaps most importantly, what happened after the vehicle could no longer continue? Search efforts quickly collided with the realities of one of the harshest environments in North America. Death Valley covers thousands of square miles of challenging terrain, including mountains, canyons, dry lake beds, and isolated valleys. Locating missing people within such an environment is extraordinarily difficult. Searchers must contend not only with distance, but also with conditions that can erase evidence and scatter clues across enormous areas. The desert does not easily surrender information. Teams searched the region around the abandoned minivan, hoping to locate signs of the missing family. Investigators considered the possibility that the travelers had attempted to walk towards safety after their vehicle became disabled. In many desert survival situations, people leave vehicles believing help lies within reach, only to discover that the landscape is far larger and more demanding than expected. Yet despite considerable effort, no immediate trace of the family could be found. Years slipped by while the mystery continued to resist both official investigations and public speculation. The case gradually became known among researchers and enthusiasts as the mystery of the Death Valley Germans. The nickname reflected both the nationality of the missing travelers and the location where their trail seemed to disappear. Over time, theories accumulated. Some focused on navigational mistakes. Others questioned whether investigators had misunderstood the family's intended destination. The absence of definitive evidence allowed uncertainty to flourish. Public fascination grew because the case seemed to challenge common assumptions about how people become lost. Death Valley is undoubtedly dangerous, but many visitors travel through it safely every year. The family had not vanished in an unexplored wilderness beyond the reach of maps. They had disappeared within a region visited by tourists, crossed by roads, and studied extensively by investigators. The mystery was not simply that they vanished, it was that their movement seemed increasingly difficult to explain. A different approach eventually emerged from someone willing to retrace the family's possible movements step by step. Independent researcher Tom Mahood became interested in the case years after the original disappearance. Rather than focusing solely on existing theories, Mahood attempted to reconstruct the family's journey using maps, field exploration, and careful analysis of available evidence. His work reflected a simple but powerful idea. Perhaps understanding the mystery required physically following the terrain that had shaped it. Following terrain that most visitors never see, researcher Tom Mahood began assembling a new understanding of the case. He studied the geography surrounding the abandoned minivan and explored routes that might explain the family's decisions. The process was demanding. Remote sections of Death Valley are difficult to access even for experienced explorers. Yet Mahood's efforts gradually revealed possibilities that earlier investigators had struggled to identify. Instead of asking why the family entered the desert, he focused on determining where they might have gone afterward. Significant discoveries finally appeared in areas so remote that reaching them required extraordinary effort. In 2009, human remains and personal items connected to the family were located in a rugged area near Butte Valley. Additional discoveries followed, helping establish that at least some members of the group had travelled much farther on foot than investigators originally suspected. These findings represented a major breakthrough after more than a decade of uncertainty. The discoveries answered some questions while creating new ones. Evidence suggested that the family had attempted to move through extremely challenging terrain after abandoning the minivan. Personal belongings and remains provided insight into portions of their route. Yet investigators still struggled to understand why that route had been chosen. Certain decisions appeared difficult to reconcile with what most travellers might have done under similar circumstances. The mystery shifted from where the family had gone to why they had gone there. Even with those discoveries, important parts of the family's final journey remained frustratingly incomplete. Not all remains were recovered, and some aspects of the timeline could only be inferred. Researchers reconstructed probable scenarios based on available evidence, but uncertainty persisted. The desert had revealed enough information to illuminate part of the story, while withholding enough to ensure that questions survived. Standing beyond every theory and every search was the same desert that had shaped the mystery from the beginning. Death Valley is often portrayed as an environment defined by heat, but its true danger lies in the way it alters perception. distances become deceptive. Routes that seem reasonable become exhausting. Landmarks appear closer than they are. Decisions that make sense in one moment can prove catastrophic in the next. The landscape influences human judgment in ways that are difficult to appreciate until someone experiences it firsthand. The story of the Death Valley Germans remains compelling because it exists at the intersection of geography and mystery. Investigators eventually learned far more than they once knew. The abandoned vehicle was no longer the only clue. The family's route was no longer entirely invisible. Yet even after years of effort, reconstruction, and discovery, the case retained elements that resisted complete understanding. The desert had given up part of the truth, but not all of it. Far beyond the last marked route on their map, the desert still holds the unanswered miles of the Death Valley German story. The woman lost near Yosemite. Millions of visitors pass through Yosemite National Park each year, with the expectation that their journeys will eventually continue elsewhere. They arrive to see granite cliffs rising above forested valleys, waterfalls plunging from great heights, and landscapes that have become symbols of the American wilderness. Most visitors spend a few days exploring trails, campgrounds, and scenic overlooks before returning to their normal lives. The park is often associated with adventure and discovery, yet it is also a place where distance, terrain, and isolation can quickly separate people from the certainty they carried with them when they arrived. Few mysteries illustrate that reality more clearly than the disappearance of Carolyn Sue Goodman. Among those traveling through California was a woman whose plans extended well beyond the park's boundaries. Carolyn Sue Goodman was not someone who appeared to be disappearing from her life. She was traveling alone, exploring the western United States, and moving through a journey that included multiple destinations. Like many independent travelers, she embraced the freedom that came with deciding where to go and how long to stay. Her trip represented movement and possibility rather than retreat. Nothing about her broader plans suggested that Yosemite would become the final place where her trail could be clearly followed. For Carolyn Sue Goodman, solo travel was part of a larger adventure rather than an unusual decision. People who knew her understood that she was capable of traveling independently and navigating unfamiliar places. The American West has long attracted travelers seeking both natural beauty and personal experience, and Yosemite stood among its most famous destinations. The park receives millions of visitors annually, many of whom arrive alone or in small groups before continuing on to the next stage of their journey. Carolyn's presence there did not initially appear remarkable. Nothing about her known activities initially suggested that concern would soon replace routine. Like countless visitors before her, she entered a park filled with established roads, marked trails, ranger stations, and areas visited by thousands of people every season. Yosemite can appear accessible and familiar, particularly in its most visited sections. Yet the park also extends far beyond those areas, encompassing hundreds of thousands of acres of mountains, forests, valleys, rivers, and remote wilderness. A person can move from heavily populated locations into remarkable isolation within a relatively short period of time. The final communication associated with Carolyn appeared ordinary when it occurred. There was no indication that it would later become the focus of intense scrutiny. Missing person investigations often begin with a message, a phone call, a conversation, or an encounter that seems insignificant at the time. Only afterward do investigators return to those moments and examine them repeatedly, searching for clues hidden within ordinary exchanges. Carolyn's case followed that pattern. Her final known contact did not immediately suggest danger. It became important only because nothing followed it. For investigators, the significance of that silence emerged gradually. Travelers occasionally change plans, delay communication, or spend longer than expected exploring a destination. Such delays rarely trigger immediate alarm. Family members and friends often assume there is a reasonable explanation. Yet every disappearance contains a moment when ordinary absence begins transforming into something more troubling. In Carolyn's case, that transition occurred as expected. Contact failed to arrive, and anticipated plans remained unfulfilled. Concern emerged gradually as expected. Contact failed to arrive. Family members eventually realized that something was wrong. The problem was not merely that Carolyn could not be reached. The problem was that her broader travel plans depended on continued movement and communication. She was expected to appear elsewhere, continue her journey, and maintain contact with people who knew where she was headed. When those expectations collapsed, The possibility that something serious had occurred became increasingly difficult to ignore. Search operations expanded across sections of Yosemite where visitors regularly disappear from view. National parks present unique challenges for investigators because they combine accessibility with vast areas of wilderness. Searchers must evaluate roads, trails, campgrounds, and remote terrain simultaneously. In Yosemite, steep elevations, dense forests, rocky terrain, and rapidly changing conditions can complicate even well-organized searches. The environment is beautiful, but beauty does not make it easy to search. Rangers, volunteers, and investigators began working to determine where Carolyn had gone and what route she might have followed. Establishing a reliable timeline became a central objective. Every confirmed sighting, transaction, and reported interaction carried potential significance. Yet as investigators worked backward through the available information, they encountered a recurring problem. The evidence was sparse. Each effort to narrow the search area seemed to reveal how much remained unknown. What investigators encountered instead of answers was an almost complete absence of evidence. Many missing person investigations eventually produce a defining clue. A vehicle is discovered, personal belongings are found. Witnesses provide a detailed account of a final encounter. Carolyn's disappearance refused to follow that pattern. Search efforts produced remarkably little information capable of establishing what happened after her final confirmed movements. The mystery was shaped not by what investigators found, but by what they failed to find. The lack of evidence complicated every attempt to build a coherent explanation. If Carolyn had suffered an accident, where had it occurred? If foul play was involved, where had the encounter taken place? If she had chosen to leave voluntarily, why did no verifiable evidence emerge to support that possibility? Each theory faced the same obstacle. The available facts were too limited to strongly support one explanation while eliminating the others. Several explanations competed for attention as the case continued without resolution. Accidental misadventure remained one possibility. Yosemite's terrain contains hazards capable of overwhelming even experienced visitors. Cliffs, rivers, remote trails, and changing weather conditions have contributed to numerous incidents throughout the park's history. Yet investigators could not identify a specific location or event capable of explaining Carolyn's disappearance. The theory remained plausible but incomplete. The possibility of foul play attracted attention as well. National parks are often perceived as places removed from ordinary crime, but they are not immune to it. Millions of visitors pass through Yosemite, creating countless interactions between strangers. The absence of evidence prevented investigators from dismissing criminal involvement, yet it also prevented them from proving it. Suspicion could not be transformed into certainty. Voluntary disappearance represented another theory, though one that faced its own challenges. People do occasionally choose to abandon established lives, travel plans, and relationships, yet such decisions typically generate some trace of intentional movement. Financial activity, communication, sightings, or other indicators often emerge over time. In Carolyn's case, investigators struggled to find evidence supporting the notion that she had deliberately vanished. The possibility remained available but difficult to substantiate. Reported sightings occasionally revived hope without providing certainty. As with many long-term missing person cases, members of the public occasionally believed they had seen Carolyn in various locations. Each report required evaluation. Some seemed promising enough to merit investigation. Others quickly proved unreliable. The pattern became familiar. A sighting would generate optimism, attract attention, and then fade under scrutiny. The investigation repeatedly returned to the same point of uncertainty. Years gradually became decades. The passage of time altered the landscape around the case but did little to resolve it. Technologies improved, investigative methods evolved, missing person databases expanded, yet none of these developments produced the breakthrough investigators hoped for. Carolyn's disappearance remained suspended between possibilities, lacking the evidence necessary to move decisively toward a conclusion. Decades later, the mystery remains shaped by what was never found. Searches can be measured by the areas covered, the hours invested, and the personnel involved. Yet their true success is measured by what they uncover. In Carolyn's case, the searches revealed the difficulty of locating answers in a landscape as vast and complex as Yosemite. The effort itself demonstrated the determination of those seeking her, while the lack of results highlighted the enduring challenge posed by the environment. Yosemite occupies a unique place in the American imagination. It is simultaneously accessible and remote, familiar and wild. Millions photograph the same landmarks every year, creating the impression that the park is fully known. Yet beyond the famous views lie immense stretches of terrain where visibility and accessibility are not the same thing. A place can be visited by millions and still contain areas capable of concealing answers for decades. Standing beyond every theory is the unanswered question that first appeared when communication stopped. Investigators have examined possible routes, evaluated competing explanations, and searched for evidence capable of illuminating Carolyn's final movements. Family members have lived with uncertainty that no search operation could fully erase. The mystery endures because the moment that transformed a traveller into a missing person remains largely invisible. Somewhere between the plans she intended to continue and the contact that never came, the trail disappeared. Long after the searchers left Yosemite, the silence that followed Carolyn Sue Goodman's last known contact continued to speak louder than any explanation. The teenager who vanished on a routine walk. Rows of houses and quiet streets often create the impression that very little can happen unnoticed. Sidewalks connect neighborhoods to schools, parks, and shopping centers, while families move through routines that repeat day after day. The predictability of suburban life encourages a sense of familiarity, and familiarity often creates confidence. People learn which routes children take home, which streets carry the most traffic, and which corners are busiest in the afternoon. Because so much appears visible, it becomes difficult to imagine how someone could simply disappear. Yet some of California's most enduring mysteries began in precisely these settings. In the growing community of Dublin, California, daily life followed rhythms that felt comfortably predictable. During the 1990s, Dublin was developing rapidly, but still retained many characteristics of a close-knit suburban city. Schools, residential neighborhoods, and local businesses formed the backdrop of everyday life. Parents expected children to return home after school. Neighbors recognized familiar faces. The environment appeared structured around routine. It was the kind of place where unusual events stood out, which made one disappearance particularly difficult for investigators to understand. For 15-year-old Eileen Mishloff, the afternoon of January 30th, 1997, began without any obvious significance. Eileen was a student at Wells Middle School and was known by friends and family as a bright teenager, with interests and plans typical of someone her age. There was nothing in her known behaviour that suggested she intended to leave her life behind. Her day unfolded in a manner that seemed entirely ordinary, making what followed even more difficult to explain. Only a short distance separated Eileen from the place where she was expected to be. After school, she began what should have been a routine walk home. The distance involved was not extraordinary. It was a journey measured in minutes rather than hours, through a suburban environment filled with homes, streets, and passing traffic. Such routes are completed successfully every day by students throughout the country. Nothing about the walk itself appeared unusual enough to attract attention. The first signs that something was wrong emerged not from evidence, but from her absence. Family members expected Eileen to arrive home as planned. When she failed to appear, concern gradually began replacing assumption. At first, there were reasonable possibilities. Perhaps she'd stopped somewhere unexpectedly or become delayed. Yet as more time passed without contact, those explanations became increasingly difficult to accept. The realization that she was missing arrived not through a dramatic discovery, but through the growing awareness that she was simply not where she was supposed to be. Investigators quickly discovered that familiarity offered fewer answers than they expected. One of the first objectives in any disappearance investigation is reconstructing the victim's final known movements. In Eileen's case, detectives examined her route home, interviewed friends and classmates, and worked to identify anyone who might have seen her after school. Yet despite the apparent simplicity of the circumstances, establishing a clear sequence of events proved remarkably difficult. The suburban environment itself became part of the mystery. Unlike disappearances that occur in remote wilderness or isolated locations, this case unfolded in an area surrounded by people. Streets connected neighborhoods, homes lined the route, vehicles moved through the area. The expectation that someone must have seen something seemed reasonable. Yet the investigation struggled to identify witnesses capable of explaining what happened to Eileen after she left school. Neither witnesses nor physical evidence provided the breakthrough detectives hoped to find. No confirmed crime scene emerged. No obvious signs of a struggle were identified. Investigators could not point to a specific location and state with confidence that it represented the place where the disappearance occurred. Instead, they were left with uncertainty spread across a relatively small geographic area. The route home remained known. What happened along that route did not. As the investigation expanded, detectives pursued numerous leads. Missing person cases often generate substantial public response, particularly when a child or teenager disappears. Community members provide information, report suspicious observations, and share possible sightings. Each tip offers potential value, but each must also be verified. Investigators examine reports from individuals who believed they had seen Eileen or noticed something unusual on the day she vanished. Most ultimately failed to provide definitive answers. Public attention grew steadily as the case remained unresolved. Missing teenagers often generate a different kind of uncertainty than missing adults. Investigators must consider a wide range of possibilities, including voluntary departure, accident, abduction, and other scenarios. Determining which explanation deserves the most attention depends on available evidence. In Eileen's case, evidence remained frustratingly limited, making it difficult to confidently prioritize one theory over another. Various leads attracted attention over the years without changing the fundamental mystery. Some theories focused on the possibility that Eileen encountered someone she knew. Others explored the idea of an opportunistic abduction. Investigators examined numerous individuals and circumstances that appeared potentially relevant. Yet each avenue eventually encountered the same obstacle. There was insufficient evidence to establish what actually happened. One of the reasons the case remained so compelling was the contrast between the environment and the outcome. People often associate disappearances with dangerous locations, unfamiliar cities, or hazardous wilderness areas. Dublin did not fit those expectations. The setting appeared ordinary. The route appeared manageable. The circumstances seemed straightforward. Yet despite those advantages, investigators found themselves confronting a mystery as difficult as many cases occurring under far more challenging conditions. Speculation expanded as the available facts remained stubbornly limited. Public discussions frequently attempted to fill gaps left by the investigation. Some observers compared Eileen's disappearance to other unsolved cases involving teenagers. Others focused on specific suspects or scenarios. Such speculation is common in long-running mysteries because people naturally seek explanations for events that seem impossible to understand. Yet speculation can also create the illusion of progress without producing actual answers. Law enforcement continued examining evidence and revisiting the case as years passed. Advances in investigative methods and forensic technology have led to breakthroughs in numerous cold cases throughout the United States. Each development creates hope that long unsolved disappearances might finally yield new information. Eileen's case remained active, and investigators periodically reviewed evidence in search of opportunities that earlier generations of detectives may not have possessed. Decades of investigation have produced questions far more readily than conclusions. The case demonstrates how difficult it can be to solve a disappearance when critical information is missing from the very beginning. Investigators know when Eileen left school. They know where she intended to go. They understand the broad outlines of her routine. Yet the event that transformed an ordinary afternoon into a mystery remains concealed. For family members, the passage of time brought no certainty. The absence of definitive answers creates a unique burden. Every possibility remains partially open because none can be conclusively eliminated. Hope persists because there is no proof of what happened. Uncertainty persists for exactly the same reason. The investigation becomes not only a search for a person, but also a search for an explanation capable of ending years of unanswered questions. Many aspects of the neighbourhood have changed since Eileen disappeared. Roads have been modified, businesses have opened and closed, and new families have moved into the community. Yet the central mystery remains surprisingly resistant to the passage of time. Physical locations may evolve, but unanswered questions often remain exactly where they were left. The route Eileen walked still exists. The explanation for what happened along it does not. Cases like this challenge assumptions about visibility and safety. People tend to believe that populated environments naturally generate witnesses and evidence. Often they do. Sometimes, however, Events occur within narrow windows of time and leave behind remarkably little information. A disappearance does not require complete isolation. Under the right circumstances, it can occur in places that seem far too ordinary to conceal anything significant. Standing at the centre of the case is a route that should have been easy to understand. Investigators have examined it repeatedly, searching for details capable of revealing where events diverge from expectation. Yet the route continues to resist explanation. The beginning is known, the destination is known. The missing piece lies somewhere between them, hidden within an afternoon that appeared completely ordinary until it wasn't. Somewhere along a suburban walk measured in minutes rather than miles, Eileen Micheloff vanished from a landscape that seemed too ordinary to hide anything at all. The girls who never reached the mall. Some mysteries begin long before anyone realizes that a normal day has already gone wrong. Plans are made, destinations are chosen, and expectations settle into place so naturally that nobody imagines they will become important later. Families assume that a trip will end where it was intended to end. Friends expect to see one another again in a few hours. The ordinary nature of these assumptions often makes their collapse especially difficult to understand. In some cases, the mystery emerges immediately. In others, it evolves slowly, changing shape as the years pass. The disappearance of Kerry Graham and Francine Trimble would become one of those cases. In the small community of Fortuna, California, two teenage friends shared plans that appeared entirely unremarkable. Fortuna sits in Humboldt County, surrounded by the forests, rivers, and rugged landscapes of Northern California. It is the kind of place where people often know one another, where routines become familiar, and where unusual events tend to attract attention. Nothing about the setting suggested that it would become connected to a disappearance that would remain unresolved for decades. For Kerry Graham and Francine Trimble, the outing ahead seemed routine enough to require little explanation. Kerry was 15 years old, while Francine was 14. The two girls were friends, and in December of 1978 they planned to travel together. According to accounts from the time, they intended to go shopping at a local mall. It was the sort of plan countless teenagers make without drawing concern from family members or friends. Their destination appeared ordinary, their intentions uncomplicated, and their absence unthinkable. The first indication that something was wrong arrived when the expected return never happened. At first, there was no obvious reason to assume danger. Delays occur. Plans change. Teenagers occasionally stay longer than expected with friends or become occupied with activities that alter their schedules. Yet as time passed, the possibility that something more serious had occurred became increasingly difficult to ignore. The girls had not returned, and there was no explanation for why. Families and investigators quickly began searching for answers. Missing person investigations involving teenagers often begin with attempts to determine whether the individuals left voluntarily. Detectives examine relationships, recent behaviour, personal circumstances, and any indication that the missing individuals intended to disappear. In the case of Kerry and Francine, investigators searched for evidence that might clarify where they had gone and what had happened after they left home. The search, however, produced remarkably little. One of the most frustrating aspects of the early investigation was the absence of reliable information about the girls' final movements. Detectives knew their intended destination, but intended destinations and actual destinations are not always the same. Without witnesses capable of providing a definitive account of what happened after they left, investigators were left trying to reconstruct events from limited evidence. The case gradually became defined by uncertainty. Days gradually became years as investigators searched for evidence that remained frustratingly out of reach. Public appeals were issued. Family members continued hoping for information that might explain what happened. Like many long-running missing person investigations, the case settled into a difficult pattern. Periodic leads emerged, generating optimism before eventually fading. The mystery remained active, yet progress proved elusive. As the years passed, the disappearance increasingly resembled other unresolved missing person cases. There were theories, but few facts. There were possibilities, but little confirmation. The absence of evidence allowed speculation to expand. Some observers believed the girls may have run away. Others suspected foul play. Without discoveries capable of supporting or eliminating those possibilities, uncertainty remained the defining feature of the investigation. More than a decade later, a discovery in a remote area transformed the direction of the investigation. In 1993, human remains were found in a wooded region of Humboldt County. The discovery immediately attracted attention because investigators recognized the possibility that the remains might be connected to unresolved disappearances from the area. What had once been a missing person investigation suddenly carried the possibility of becoming something very different. The process of identifying the remains took time, but eventually investigators determined that they belonged to Kerry Graham and Francine Trimble. The discovery answered one question while creating many others. The girls had not disappeared voluntarily into new lives. They had not simply vanished beyond the reach of investigators. The case was now understood as a homicide investigation. Yet knowing that fact did not explain who was responsible or why the crime had occurred. What initially appeared to be the beginning of closure quickly became the source of new uncertainty. Families often hope that discoveries will provide answers, but evidence sometimes reveals only part of the truth. Investigators now understood that the girls had died, yet critical details remained unknown. What happened after they left home? How had they reached the location where their remains were discovered? Who had been with them? The case had changed dramatically, but it had not been solved. Attention eventually focused on a man whose history raised disturbing possibilities. Investigators examined connections involving Curtis Dean Anderson, a convicted kidnapper and murderer whose criminal history included crimes against young women. Anderson became an important figure in the investigation because evidence suggested he may have been connected to the disappearance and deaths of Kerry and Francine. The possibility immediately attracted significant interest. Anderson's background appeared relevant for reasons investigators could not ignore. His documented crimes demonstrated a willingness to target vulnerable victims, and aspects of his history seemed consistent with concerns surrounding the case. Detectives examined available evidence, interviewed individuals, and worked to determine whether the connection could be firmly established. Over time, information emerged that strengthened suspicions regarding his involvement. Yet even as evidence increasingly pointed in a particular direction, important uncertainties remained. Anderson died in prison in 2007, limiting opportunities to obtain further information directly from him. As a result, investigators faced a familiar challenge. Evidence could suggest involvement without necessarily answering every question. Establishing who may have committed a crime is not the same as fully understanding how events unfolded. Even when important pieces of the puzzle began falling into place, gaps remained. Investigators developed a clearer understanding of what likely happened than they possessed during the early years of the case. Yet significant portions of the story continued to resist reconstruction. Missing person cases that evolve into homicide investigations often reveal this tension. Discoveries provide clarity while simultaneously exposing the limits of what can still be known. Time altered the case in ways few investigators could have predicted during the original search. What began as a disappearance gradually transformed into a homicide investigation, supported by evidence unavailable during the early years. Public understanding shifted alongside the investigation. People who once viewed the case as a missing person mystery increasingly recognized it as part of a broader effort to understand violent crimes that had remained hidden for years. The evolution of the case also demonstrated how investigations can change as new evidence emerges. Early assumptions may prove incorrect. Theories once considered plausible may lose credibility. Facts discovered years later can fundamentally alter the understanding of what occurred. Kerry and Francine's case serves as a powerful example of how the passage of time can reshape a mystery without fully resolving it. Several facts are now understood with far greater confidence than they once were. Investigators know that the girls did not simply disappear without explanation. They know that the case involved criminal violence. They know that discoveries made years after the disappearance fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. These facts provide a level of certainty that was absent during the early years. Standing beyond those facts are questions that continue to resist definitive answers. Investigators may possess a stronger understanding of what happened than they once did, but understanding is not the same as complete knowledge. Important details remain unknown. The precise sequence of events, the circumstances surrounding the girls' final hours, and aspects of the crime itself remain subjects of uncertainty. The mystery survived the discoveries because the discoveries were incomplete. The story of Kerry Graham and Francine Trimble remains haunting precisely because it evolved so dramatically. A routine outing became a disappearance. A disappearance became a long-running mystery. a mystery became a homicide investigation. Each transformation appeared to bring investigators closer to the truth, yet each also revealed how much remained hidden. The case demonstrates that finding evidence does not always end a mystery. Sometimes it changes the mystery into something even more complicated. What began as a missing person case ended with discoveries nobody expected. Yet the most important part of Kerry Graham and Francine Trimble's story remains unfinished: the missing victims of Sonoma County. The true weight of certain disappearances only emerges when their stories begin to overlap. A single disappearance can be explained away as an isolated tragedy, the result of circumstances unique to one victim and one moment in time. Multiple disappearances occurring across the same region create a different kind of unease. Patterns begin to emerge where none seemed to exist before, and events that once appeared unrelated start to resemble pieces of a larger puzzle. In Northern California during the 1970s, investigators slowly found themselves confronting exactly that possibility. Throughout the 1970s, Northern California experienced a series of disappearances that initially appeared unrelated. The region was changing rapidly during the era. Communities expanded, highways connected growing towns, and young people moved through a culture that often embraced independence and mobility. Hitchhiking remained relatively common among teenagers and young adults, particularly in areas where public transportation was limited and distances between destinations were considerable. Within that environment, the disappearance of a young woman could initially seem like a case belonging only to her family and local investigators. Individual case files accumulated within different jurisdictions, each carrying its own questions and uncertainties. Young women vanished under varying circumstances, leaving detectives with separate investigations and separate timelines. Missing person reports were filed, families searched for answers, and communities struggled to understand what had happened. At first, there was little reason to believe these incidents shared a common cause. Each case appeared to stand on its own. Among the earliest victims associated with what would later become known as the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders were teenage girls and young women who disappeared while traveling through parts of Sonoma County and surrounding areas. Some were last seen hitchhiking. Others vanished while moving between familiar locations. Their ages, lifestyles, and circumstances varied enough that investigators did not immediately recognize a pattern. The cases remained fragmented, separated by time, geography, and limited evidence. Gradually, investigators began noticing details that seemed strangely familiar from one case to the next. The similarities did not emerge through a dramatic discovery, but through comparison. Detectives reviewing reports observed recurring characteristics involving victim profiles, locations, and circumstances surrounding disappearances. The connections were subtle at first. No single detail proved that the cases were linked. Yet taken together, the similarities became increasingly difficult to dismiss. What emerged was not a solution, but the outline of a possible pattern. Several victims were young women. Multiple disappearances occurred within a relatively concentrated geographic region. In some cases, remains were discovered in remote areas, far from where victims were last seen. The pattern suggested the possibility that investigators were not dealing with unrelated crimes. Instead, they might be confronting a single offender operating across Northern California. The discovery of victims' remains transformed the investigations. Missing person cases became homicide investigations, introducing new questions and new urgency. Remote locations where bodies were found often complicated efforts to reconstruct events. Evidence deteriorates over time, particularly in outdoor environments exposed to weather, animals, and natural processes. Investigators work to determine how the victims had died and whether the crime shared common characteristics. Each discovery provided information while simultaneously revealing how much remained unknown. Communities across Sonoma County responded differently once the similarities became harder to ignore. Fear spread among families, particularly those with teenage daughters. The idea that a predator might be targeting young women altered perceptions of safety throughout the region. Behaviours that once seemed routine began attracting concern. Parents warned children about accepting rides from strangers. Discussions about personal safety became increasingly common. The possibility of a serial offender changed the way people viewed everyday risks. Additional victims brought new evidence while simultaneously expanding the scope of the mystery. Each new disappearance increased the pressure on investigators while complicating the investigation itself. Serial crimes create a difficult challenge because every additional case adds information while also increasing the number of variables detectives must consider. Determining whether similarities reflect a genuine connection or mere coincidence becomes critically important. In Sonoma County, the similarities appeared increasingly significant. As investigators compared evidence across cases, the notion of a single offender gained momentum. The geographic concentration of disappearances and discoveries suggested that someone familiar with the region might be involved. Remote locations where victims were found implied knowledge of local terrain. Yet identifying a suspect capable of connecting all the cases proved extraordinarily difficult. Investigators faced the challenge of searching for an unknown individual whose crimes may have stretched across years. Attention increasingly turned toward the possibility that a single offender was moving unnoticed through the region. Serial crime investigations often depend upon recognizing behavioral patterns. Detectives attempt to determine how victims were selected, how crimes were committed, and what actions connected individual cases. In the Santa Rosa investigations, those efforts produced possibilities rather than certainty. While many investigators believed a common offender was likely responsible for at least some of the crimes, proving that conclusion remained difficult. Public fascination with the mystery grew as media coverage expanded. The phrase Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders entered public consciousness, providing a label that linked the cases together. Yet labels can create their own challenges. Once separate crimes become grouped under a single name, assumptions sometimes develop faster than evidence. Investigators had to balance the appeal of a unified explanation against the reality that not every case fit perfectly within the emerging pattern. Various suspects entered discussions over the years without providing the certainty investigators sought. Among the names most frequently associated with the case was Arthur Lee Allen. Allen attracted attention because of his connection to another famous unsolved mystery, the Zodiac Killer investigation. Some researchers believed similarities between the cases warranted examination. However, no definitive evidence established that Allen was responsible for the Santa Rosa crimes. Other suspects emerged as investigators explored different theories. Some possessed criminal histories, others had geographic connections to relevant locations. Certain individuals appeared promising for a period before evidence failed to support continued focus on them. The pattern repeated throughout the decades. A suspect would generate interest, attract scrutiny, and then fall short of providing the answers investigators needed. Complications arose because the pattern itself was never entirely straightforward. Not every victim disappeared under identical circumstances. Not every case contained the same type of evidence. Some investigators questioned whether all the crimes attributed to the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders truly belonged to a single offender. Others argued that multiple perpetrators might be responsible. The uncertainty surrounding the pattern became one of the central challenges of the investigation. This ambiguity created a paradox. The similarities between cases appeared strong enough to suggest a connection, yet the differences prevented investigators from confidently defining that connection. If one offender was responsible, identifying that individual remained elusive. If multiple offenders were involved, determining which crimes belonged together became equally difficult. The pattern that helped unite the cases also complicated efforts to solve them. Many decades have passed since the original investigations first attempted to connect the cases. Advances in forensic science have transformed criminal investigations throughout the United States, leading to breakthroughs in numerous cold cases. DNA analysis, improved evidence processing, and renewed investigative reviews have all generated hope that long unsolved mysteries might eventually yield answers. Yet despite those advances, the Santa Rosa cases remain unresolved. Researchers, journalists, and independent investigators continue examining the evidence. New theories emerge periodically, often focusing on suspects who were previously overlooked or reinterpreting information already known. Such efforts reflect the enduring fascination surrounding the mystery. People remain drawn to the case because it appears tantalizingly close to explanation. The pattern seems visible, the victims are known, the missing piece is the identity of the person, or persons, responsible. Behind every theory and every suspect remain the young women whose disappearances started the search for answers. Discussions about offenders, evidence, and investigative strategy can sometimes overshadow the individuals at the center of the story. Each victim had a life beyond the circumstances of her disappearance. Each left behind family members, friends, and communities forced to live with uncertainty. The mystery is compelling, but the human cost remains its most important dimension. Standing unresolved at the centre of the case is the question that first emerged when investigators compared the files side by side. Were they truly looking at the work of a single predator, or had separate tragedies gradually merged into a larger narrative that concealed as much as it revealed? Decades of investigation have produced evidence, suspects, and theories, yet none have definitively answered that question. The pattern remains visible. The person behind it does not. The connections between the cases became clearer over time, yet the person who may have created them never emerged from the shadows. The girl who vanished from a cabin of horror. By the time investigators entered Cabin 28, the mystery was already waiting for them. The small structure stood within the mountain community of Keddie, California, surrounded by pine-covered slopes and quiet roads that wound through the Sierra Nevada foothills. Nothing about the location suggested that it would become the setting for one of the most disturbing crimes in California history. Yet on the morning of April 12, 1981, investigators stepped into a scene so violent and confusing that understanding what had happened would take years. Even then, one of the strangest questions would emerge not from what they found, but from what they didn't. Tucked within the small mountain community of Keddie, the cabin had appeared unremarkable only hours earlier. Keddie was a modest resort town in Plumas County, known more for its forests and outdoor recreation than for crime. Families lived alongside vacation cabins, and the area attracted visitors seeking a quieter pace of life. For many residents, the isolation of the mountains represented safety rather than danger. That perception would change dramatically after the events inside Cabin 28 became known. Members of the Sharp family occupied the center of a tragedy that would become one of California's most infamous unsolved cases. Sue Sharp lived in the cabin with several of her children after relocating to Keddie following a divorce. Like many families attempting to rebuild their lives, they had settled into routines shaped by school, friendships, and the rhythms of daily life. There was little indication that the family would soon become connected to a crime still discussed decades later. The events of the night of April 11th and the early hours of April 12th remain the subject of extensive investigation and debate. What is known with certainty is that multiple members of the Sharp family and a family friend were inside Cabin 28 that night. At some point, violence erupted. The attack was brutal and chaotic, leaving behind evidence that suggested a prolonged struggle had taken place within the cabin. As authorities worked to understand what had happened inside the cabin, an unexpected problem emerged. Investigators began the process common to all major crime scenes: identifying victims, locating survivors, and determining who had been present. The task seemed straightforward at first. Several victims had already been found. Other children inside the home had survived the night. Yet as detectives compared names, relationships, and expected occupants, they realized something did not add up. One name remained unaccounted for when investigators compared the scene against the people who should have been there. Tina Sharp, Sue Sharp's 12-year-old daughter, was missing. Unlike the others, she was not among the victims discovered inside the cabin. She was not among the surviving children found elsewhere in the home. Her absence immediately transformed the investigation. Detectives were no longer dealing solely with a homicide case. They were also confronting a disappearance. The realization raised disturbing possibilities. Had Tina fled during the attack? Had she been hidden somewhere nearby? Or had someone removed her from the cabin entirely? Each possibility suggested a different sequence of events and a different understanding of what had happened that night. Investigators knew that answering those questions might be essential to solving the broader crime. Search efforts quickly expanded beyond the boundaries of the crime scene itself. Law enforcement officers searched the area surrounding Cabin 28, hoping to find signs that Tina had escaped and become lost in the nearby woods. The mountainous terrain around Keddie offered numerous places where a frightened child could seek shelter or concealment. Searchers examined trails, wooded areas, and nearby structures, yet despite those efforts, no trace of Tina was found. The lack of evidence only deepened the mystery. Crime scenes typically generate clues that point investigators in specific directions. Tina's disappearance seemed to generate questions instead. There was no confirmed sighting of her after the attack. There was no clear indication of whether she had left voluntarily or been taken. Every explanation required assumptions unsupported by direct evidence. The longer Tina Sharp remained missing, the more significant her absence became. Investigators recognized that if she had survived the attack, she might possess information capable of identifying those responsible. Her disappearance therefore carried implications beyond her own fate. It suggested that someone may have wanted her removed from the scene, yet proving such a theory required evidence investigators did not possess. Public attention soon focused heavily on the case. The Keddy murders were already shocking because of the violence involved. Tina's disappearance added another layer of mystery. Many crimes become easier to categorize once investigators understand who the victims were and where they were located. This case resisted such clarity. The missing girl represented an unresolved element within an already complicated investigation. Detectives explored numerous theories regarding Tina's disappearance. Some believed she had been abducted during or after the attack. Others considered whether someone involved in the crime had specifically targeted her. The challenge was that available evidence supported multiple interpretations while conclusively proving none. As the investigation continued, Tina's disappearance remained one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. Attention eventually turned toward individuals who became subjects of interest in the broader Keddy murders investigation. Over the years, investigators examined various suspects and theories concerning who may have been responsible for the attack on the Sharp family. Yet even as those inquiries evolved, Tina's disappearance remained difficult to explain. Understanding what happened to her required understanding events that had never been fully reconstructed. Years passed without providing the explanation investigators hoped to find. The search for Tina continued, but no confirmed evidence emerged to establish where she had gone or what had happened after the attack. For her family, the uncertainty created a unique burden. The victims found inside cabin 28 had at least been accounted for. Tina remained missing, suspended between possibility and unknown reality. The passage of time gradually transformed the disappearance into a cold case, yet the mystery never fully faded. Researchers, journalists, and investigators revisiting the Keddy murders repeatedly returned to the same troubling fact. Among all the violence and confusion inside cabin 28, one victim had not been found. Her absence seemed impossible to ignore and equally impossible to explain. A discovery made far from Keddy eventually altered the direction of the investigation. In 1984, 3 years after the murders, a bottle collector searching in a remote area of Butte County discovered a human skull. Additional remains were later found nearby. Investigators eventually determined that the remains belonged to Tina Sharp. The discovery ended one mystery while immediately creating another. Finding Tina's remains confirmed that she had not survived the events that began at cabin 28. Yet the location where the remains were found introduced new questions. The site was miles from Keddy. Determining how Tina arrived there, when she was taken there, and what had happened during the period between her disappearance and death proved extraordinarily difficult. The discovery provided evidence but not a complete narrative. What should have answered the mystery instead introduced another layer of uncertainty. Investigators now knew Tina's fate, but they still lacked a clear understanding of the circumstances surrounding it. Had she been abducted directly from the cabin? Was she transported elsewhere before her death? Were the individuals responsible for her disappearance the same people responsible for the murders inside cabin 28? The answers remained elusive. Discussion of the Keddy murders often overshadows the unusual nature of Tina's disappearance. The crime scene itself attracts significant attention because of its brutality and complexity. Yet Tina's case remains unique even within that context. She was not simply another victim connected to the event. She was the missing piece of a crime scene that investigators struggled to assemble from the very beginning. The broader investigation into the Keddy murders continued for decades. New evidence emerged periodically, and advances in forensic technology prompted renewed examinations of the case. Investigators developed stronger theories regarding who may have been responsible for the crimes. Even so, significant uncertainties remained. Tina's disappearance and death continue to occupy a central place among those unresolved questions. Standing at the center of the unanswered questions is the fact that one victim was missing from the beginning. Investigators entered cabin 28 expecting to reconstruct a violent crime. Instead, they found themselves confronting a second mystery hidden inside the first. Every effort to understand what happened that night eventually led back to Tina Sharp, and the unanswered questions surrounding her absence. When investigators first counted the people inside cabin 28, the most important clue may have been the person who was not there. The child who disappeared without leaving a trace. A handful of cases move from one promising lead to another without ever arriving at a conclusion. A witness comes forward, a sighting is reported, or a new lead emerges that appears capable of finally explaining what happened. For a brief moment, uncertainty seems ready to give way to answers. Then the lead fades, the evidence weakens, and the mystery remains exactly where it was before. The disappearance of Amber Swartz became one of those cases, a story defined not only by what was unknown, but by how often the unknown seemed on the verge of being resolved. Across Northern California, school days came and went with the predictability people rarely think about until it disappears. Students attended classes, met friends, boarded buses, and returned home through routines repeated hundreds of times each year. Parents relied on those routines because they usually worked. Most afternoons ended exactly as expected. When something interrupted that pattern, the disruption stood out immediately. Yet even then, few people could imagine how long the questions might last. Amber Swartz was 14 years old when an ordinary day unexpectedly became the dividing line between what was known and what would remain uncertain. She lived in Pinole, California, and was a student whose life revolved around the normal experiences of adolescence. Family members and friends knew her as a teenager with plans, relationships, and responsibilities typical for someone her age. Nothing about her circumstances suggested that she was preparing to disappear. The events of June 3, 1988, initially appeared routine. Amber attended school and moved through the day like countless students across California. At some point after leaving school, however, the ordinary sequence of events that should have carried her home began to unravel. The details of her final confirmed movements were limited, and that limitation would become one of the central challenges facing those who search for her. Concern developed quickly after Amber failed to return as expected. Missing person cases involving teenagers often force families to confront a difficult uncertainty during the earliest hours. A delay may have an innocent explanation, yet every passing hour increases concern. In Amber's case, family members soon realized that something was wrong. The absence could no longer be explained by a simple change of plans or a temporary misunderstanding. Authorities began gathering information and reconstructing the known timeline of her day. Detectives examined her activities, spoke with people who knew her, and attempted to identify anyone who might have seen her after school. As often happens in cases involving young people, investigators initially explored a wide range of possibilities. Determining which information mattered most proved difficult because the available facts were limited from the beginning. At first, several reports suggested that answers might arrive sooner rather than later. Witnesses and members of the public provided information that appeared promising. Certain accounts seemed capable of extending the timeline beyond Amber's last confirmed movements. Each report offered a possible direction for investigators to pursue, creating hope that the mystery might be resolved before it had time to grow colder. One of the recurring challenges involved separating reliable observations from assumptions and mistaken recollections. Missing person investigations often generate large numbers of tips, particularly when a case receives media attention. People may sincerely believe they saw the missing person, only for further examination to reveal inconsistencies. Detectives must evaluate every lead carefully, because even an inaccurate report can consume valuable resources. Each promising development seemed to move the search forward before slipping away under closer examination. A reported sighting would appear credible. Investigators would follow the lead. Additional information would be gathered. Then the details would fail to align. What initially seemed like a breakthrough would become another dead end. The cycle repeated itself often enough that it became one of the defining features of the case. Family members experienced these developments differently from investigators. Every new report carried the possibility that Amber had been found, or that someone finally knew what had happened. Hope accompanied each lead, even when experience suggested caution. The emotional toll of repeated disappointment can be difficult to measure. Every promising development offered the possibility of resolution while also creating the risk of another setback. Additional sightings continued appearing long after the initial disappearance. Reports surfaced from various locations and under varying circumstances. Some individuals believed they had encountered Amber. Others thought they recognized her from photographs distributed through missing person campaigns. The existence of these reports kept the case active in the public imagination, but activity and progress are not always the same thing. The persistence of sightings created a paradox. On one hand, they suggested that people remained engaged with the search and continued looking for answers. On the other hand, the sheer number of unverified reports made it harder to determine which information deserved the greatest attention. Detectives were forced to balance openness to new possibilities with skepticism regarding evidence that could not be confirmed. Questions multiplied as competing explanations emerged from the limited information available. Some observers believed Amber may have been abducted. Others considered whether she might have left voluntarily. Various theories attempted to account for the disappearance, each drawing support from different interpretations of the available evidence. Yet none succeeded in explaining the case completely. The challenge was not merely that evidence was missing, it was that the evidence which did exist often pointed in different directions. Certain leads suggested one possibility. Other information appeared to support another. The result was an investigation that seemed perpetually close to a breakthrough, without ever reaching one. Every path forward eventually encountered uncertainty. Public attention endured because the mystery repeatedly appeared capable of resolving itself. Cases that remain entirely silent often fade from view over time. Amber's disappearance followed a different pattern. New reports periodically revived interest. Media coverage returned. Discussions resumed. People wondered whether the latest lead would finally provide answers. Again and again, those expectations proved premature. Reliable evidence proved far more difficult to obtain than potential leads. Investigators could collect reports, evaluate witness statements, and pursue tips, but building a definitive explanation required something stronger. The case highlighted a reality familiar to detectives who work long-term disappearances. Information is not the same as evidence, and evidence is not the same as proof. The distance between those categories can be enormous. As years passed, Amber's disappearance became one of many unresolved missing person cases that continued to resist closure. Yet the case retained a distinctive quality because of the recurring reports associated with it. Rather than fading into complete silence, it remained accompanied by intermittent suggestions that answers might still be found. The mystery seemed unwilling to settle into a final shape. Family members and supporters continued efforts to keep attention focused on the case. Maintaining public awareness serves an important purpose in unresolved disappearances. New witnesses may emerge, memories may be refreshed, and information previously overlooked may become significant. Hope often depends upon the possibility that someone, somewhere, knows something that has not yet been shared. Decades later, the mystery remains suspended between possibility and proof. Investigators can point to numerous leads, reported sightings, and theories that emerged over the years. What they cannot do is connect those pieces into a verified account of what happened after Amber disappeared. The distance between possibility and certainty remains as significant as ever. Cases like Amber Swartz's reveal how uncertainty can evolve over time. Some mysteries are defined by a lack of information. Others are defined by an abundance of information that never becomes conclusive. Amber's disappearance belongs to the second category. The investigation repeatedly approached what appeared to be meaningful progress, only to find that the apparent breakthrough could not withstand scrutiny. Every new sighting seemed to suggest that the mystery was about to reveal itself, yet the same question continued waiting at the center of the case. What became of Amber after the last confirmed point in her timeline? Years of investigation produced possibilities, but none succeeded in transforming uncertainty into fact. For years, Amber Swartz seemed to remain just beyond the reach of certainty, leaving investigators with a trail of possibilities that never became answers. The nurse who never came home. Even when no new answers emerge, a disappearance can become increasingly difficult to understand. A person vanishes, an investigation begins, and authorities search for evidence capable of explaining what happened. Then, instead of answers, new information appears that complicates the mystery. Messages surface, rumors spread, connections emerge that may or may not be real. The original disappearance remains unsolved, yet it gradually becomes attached to something larger. Few California cases illustrate that progression more clearly than the disappearance of Donna Lass. In South Lake Tahoe, thousands of visitors moved through the town every year without leaving much trace behind. Nestled among mountains and forests along the California-Nevada border, the area attracted tourists seeking casinos, recreation, and seasonal employment. People arrived from different states, stayed for varying lengths of time, and often moved on again. The constant flow of visitors created a community where unfamiliar faces were common, and departures rarely attracted attention. Against that backdrop, one missing person might initially seem difficult to distinguish from countless ordinary movements. Donna Lass appeared to be building a normal life far from the mystery that would later surround her name. Born in South Dakota, she trained as a nurse before eventually relocating to South Lake Tahoe. She worked at the Sahara Tahoe Hotel and Casino, where she served as a nurse for employees and guests. Friends and co-workers described her as reliable and responsible. Her life seemed stable, defined by work, friendships, and the routines associated with living in a busy resort town. The final confirmed hours of her known movements offered little indication of what was about to happen. On September 6, 1970, Donna completed her shift at the Sahara Tahoe. There was nothing immediately unusual about the evening. She was expected to continue with the normal routines that followed work. Instead, sometime after her shift ended, the trail of verifiable information came to an abrupt stop. The simplicity of that transition would become one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. Concern quickly shifted into investigation when Donna failed to appear where she was expected. Friends and acquaintances soon realized that something was wrong. Missing person investigations often begin with attempts to reconstruct ordinary activities because ordinary activities frequently contain the final clues. Detectives sought to determine where Donna intended to go after work, who she planned to meet, and whether anyone had seen her after she left the casino. Establishing a reliable timeline became the immediate priority. Investigators quickly encountered uncertainty. Reports emerged that someone had contacted Donna's landlord shortly after her disappearance, claiming that she had left because of a family emergency. Yet family members denied knowledge of any emergency requiring her sudden departure. The communication immediately attracted attention because it appeared designed to explain her absence. Whether it represented a misunderstanding, a deliberate deception, or something else entirely remained unclear. What was certain was that it complicated efforts to understand what had happened. Then information began emerging that complicated the search rather than simplifying it. Rather than producing a straightforward explanation, each new development seemed to create additional questions. Detectives examined Donna's personal life, professional relationships, and recent activities. They searched for signs that she intended to leave voluntarily. They explored the possibility of foul play. Yet despite those efforts, no clear explanation emerged. The investigation appeared suspended between multiple possibilities. One challenge involved the absence of physical evidence. Many disappearances eventually generate clues capable of directing investigators toward a specific conclusion. A vehicle may be discovered, personal belongings may surface, witnesses may provide detailed accounts of a final encounter. Donna's case offered remarkably little. The lack of evidence did not eliminate any major theory, making it difficult for detectives to determine which explanation deserved the greatest attention. Each new development seemed to push the case beyond the boundaries of an ordinary disappearance. As months passed without answers, public interest continued. Friends and family hoped that new information might reveal where Donna had gone. Instead, the mystery remained unresolved. Then, nearly a year after she vanished, an unusual communication arrived that would permanently alter the way many people viewed the case. A postcard mailed months later would change the way many people viewed the mystery. In March 1971, a postcard later known as the Pines card was sent to the San Francisco Chronicle. The card contained images and wording that appeared to reference a location in the Lake Tahoe region. Some investigators and researchers interpreted elements of the postcard as a possible reference to Donna Lass. The suggestion immediately attracted attention because of another name already associated with communications sent to newspapers. The possibility of a connection to the Zodiac killer introduced an entirely new layer of uncertainty. The Zodiac had already become one of the most infamous unidentified criminals in American history. Through letters and coded messages sent to newspapers, the killer transformed crimes into a broader public mystery. When the Pines card appeared, speculation quickly emerged that Donna Lass might have become another victim connected to that larger case. Investigators approached the possibility cautiously. While similarities and references attracted attention, establishing a definitive connection proved difficult. The Zodiac case itself contained numerous uncertainties, and not every communication attributed to the killer has been accepted without debate. The same challenge applied to the Pines card. Was it genuinely connected to Donna's disappearance? Was it connected to the Zodiac? Or was it something else entirely? Each possibility carried different implications. Public fascination with the potential connection grew because it transformed the case. Before the postcard, Donna's disappearance existed primarily as a local mystery centered on South Lake Tahoe. Afterward, it became linked in public discussion to one of the most famous unsolved criminal investigations in American history. The disappearance no longer stood alone, it existed in the shadow of another mystery. Separating evidence from speculation became increasingly difficult as the years passed. Discussions about Donna Lass often became intertwined with discussions about the Zodiac killer. Researchers examined maps, timelines, communications, and possible geographic connections. Some believed the association was significant, others argued that the available evidence remained too weak to support a definitive conclusion. The debate itself became part of the case. Meanwhile, the original question remained unchanged. Regardless of any Zodiac connection, Donna Lass was still missing. Theories concerning a famous unidentified killer did not explain where she went after leaving work, what happened during her final known hours, or why no conclusive evidence emerged. The larger mystery risked overshadowing the smaller one, even though the smaller mystery came first. Years became decades, yet the disappearance continued to resist resolution. Law enforcement agencies revisited evidence. Independent researchers examined records and timelines. Family members and interested observers continued searching for answers. Advances in investigative methods generated hope that new discoveries might emerge, yet the case remained suspended between possibilities. One reason the disappearance continues to attract attention is the contrast between its apparent simplicity and its enduring uncertainty. Investigators know who Donna was, they know where she worked, they know when she completed her shift, they know that concern developed quickly afterward. Beyond those facts, certainty becomes difficult to find. The mystery begins in a familiar place, and then abruptly expands into uncertainty. Decades later, the disappearance remains suspended between competing interpretations. Some people view the case primarily through the lens of the possible Zodiac connection. Others focus on the original investigation and the circumstances surrounding Donna's life in South Lake Tahoe. Both perspectives attempt to explain the same disappearance, yet neither has produced a definitive answer. The result is a case that seems to exist between two overlapping mysteries. Cases involving strange communications often create a unique challenge. Messages attract attention because they appear meaningful, but meaning and truth are not always the same thing. The Pines card may represent an important clue. It may represent a deliberate attempt to mislead. It may represent something investigators never fully understood. The uncertainty surrounding the communication mirrors the uncertainty surrounding Donna herself. Standing behind every theory is the unanswered question that existed before the postcards, rumours, and speculation began. A nurse finished her shift in South Lake Tahoe and never returned home. Everything that followed grew outward from that simple fact. The messages, the theories, and the possible connections all emerged later. The central mystery remains rooted in the disappearance itself. Long after the messages became part of the mystery, nobody could explain what happened to Donna Lass after her final shift ended. The girl who accepted a ride. A single decision can separate an ordinary day from a mystery that lasts for decades. Most choices pass unnoticed because they lead exactly where people expect them to lead. A bus is boarded, a ride is accepted, a journey ends, and life continues. Only afterward does anyone realize that a seemingly insignificant moment carried consequences far greater than anyone could have imagined. In some cases, the mystery begins with an unknown event hidden from view. In others, the mystery begins with a decision that people actually witnessed. The disappearance of Robin Graham belongs to the second category. In Southern California during the autumn of 1970, thousands of people moved through their routines without imagining how quickly plans could change. Los Angeles County was already a vast network of highways, neighborhoods, and growing suburbs connected by endless streams of traffic. Every day, commuters traveled familiar routes, while students moved between schools, homes, and social activities. The scale of the region created a strange contrast. Millions of people shared the same roads, yet an individual could still disappear within the movement of the crowd. Robin Graham was 14 years old when a seemingly minor disruption altered the course of her day. She lived with her family in Southern California and was known as a typical teenager with responsibilities, friendships, and plans for the future. Nothing in her known circumstances suggested that she was preparing to leave her life behind. Her disappearance would become one of California's longest-running mysteries, precisely because it appeared to emerge from such an ordinary situation. On November 15, 1970, Robin attended a football game at Pierce College in Woodland Hills. At some point afterward, she missed the bus she intended to take home. Missing transportation is a common inconvenience, particularly for teenagers. Alternative arrangements are often made without difficulty. Yet what followed would transform a routine problem into an enduring mystery. Missing her usual transportation forced Robin to consider another way home. At the time, hitchhiking was more common than it would later become. Although concerns about safety certainly existed, accepting rides from strangers was not viewed with the same level of alarm that would characterize later decades. For many young people, hitchhiking represented a practical solution when transportation plans fell apart. Robin appears to have viewed the situation in much the same way. Several witnesses later recalled seeing her beside a California freeway. Accounts placed Robin near the southbound San Diego freeway, known today as Interstate 405. Witnesses observed a teenage girl matching her description attempting to obtain a ride. The observations would become critically important because they established the final confirmed stage of Robin's known movements. Unlike many disappearances, investigators were not left completely in the dark regarding where she had last been seen. The most important observation came when people watched Robin accept a ride. Witnesses reported seeing her enter a vehicle driven by an unidentified man. Descriptions of the driver and vehicle varied in certain details, but the significance of the event remained clear. Investigators now possessed something many missing person cases never receive: a final confirmed interaction involving another person. The problem was that identifying that person would prove extraordinarily difficult. Everything investigators know with confidence ends at that moment. Once Robin entered the vehicle, certainty disappeared. There are no verified accounts of where she went next. No confirmed witnesses observed her after the ride began. No reliable evidence established the route the driver took or the destination he intended to reach. The mystery begins precisely where the witness accounts end. Concern developed when Robin failed to return home. Family members soon realized that something was wrong, and an investigation began. Detectives worked to reconstruct her final known movements, interviewing witnesses and gathering every available detail about the driver and vehicle. Because the last confirmed event involved another person, identifying that individual became one of the central objectives of the case. Efforts to identify the driver became a central focus of the investigation. Witness descriptions allowed investigators to develop an image of the man who had provided the ride. Yet descriptions alone rarely solve cases. Detectives needed a name, a vehicle, or some other piece of evidence capable of transforming a witness account into a suspect. The challenge was that Southern California contained countless drivers who might loosely fit available descriptions. The search expanded as investigators followed leads and examined individuals who appeared potentially relevant. Missing person investigations often generate substantial public response, and Robin's case was no exception. Members of the public provided information, reported suspicious individuals, and suggested possible explanations. Each lead required careful examination. Some appeared promising, others collapsed quickly under scrutiny. None produced definitive answers. Numerous leads emerged over the years without resolving the mystery. Like many long-running disappearances, Robin's case attracted attention from both law enforcement and independent researchers. Various persons of interest entered public discussion at different times. Certain individuals appeared capable of explaining the disappearance, at least temporarily. Yet evidence sufficient to conclusively connect any suspect to Robin never emerged. One reason the case remained compelling was that investigators seemed unusually close to understanding the beginning of the mystery. In many disappearances, authorities struggled to determine where a person was last seen or what happened during their final hours. Robin's case appeared different. Witnesses observed her. Witnesses observed the vehicle. Witnesses observed the decision that changed everything. Yet despite possessing those details, Investigators could not move beyond them. The passage of time changed many aspects of the case, but not its central uncertainty. Roads changed, communities expanded, technologies advanced, investigative methods improved dramatically. Yet the disappearance itself remained fixed in place, anchored to the same unanswered questions that existed in 1970. What happened after Robin entered the vehicle? Who was the driver? Why did she never return home? As decades passed, theories continued to emerge. Some focused on specific suspects. Others examined broader possibilities involving crimes against young women during the era. Researchers compared timelines, reviewed witness accounts, and revisited evidence. Such efforts reflected a persistent belief that the mystery might still be solvable. After all, the case began with a witnessed event rather than complete uncertainty. The challenge was that witnesses had seen enough to establish a beginning, but not enough to reveal an ending. Their observations narrowed the range of possibilities while still leaving enormous gaps. Investigators knew Robin entered a vehicle. They did not know what occurred afterward. The distinction may seem small, but it represents the difference between a lead and a solution. Returning to the witness accounts means returning to the last confirmed decision Robin ever made. Every investigation, every theory, and every attempt to solve the case eventually circles back to that roadside moment. It remains the clearest part of the story and the most frustrating. People observed the choice, they observed the vehicle, they observed the driver. Yet none of those observations explained what happened next. The passage of nearly half a century has not diminished the significance of that moment. If anything, time has emphasized it. As memories fade and evidence becomes more difficult to recover, the final witnessed decision assumes even greater importance. It represents the point where certainty ends and mystery begins. Everything before it can be described. Everything after it remains hidden. Standing between what is known and what remains hidden is a vehicle that disappeared into traffic nearly half a century ago. Somewhere beyond the witness accounts lies the explanation investigators spent decades trying to uncover. Whether that explanation involves a stranger, a crime, or circumstances never fully understood, it remains beyond reach. The road continued. The driver continued. Only Robin Graham vanished. The ride lasted only moments in the view of witnesses, but what followed has remained unexplained for decades.